Hi, I'm Jamie Maciek, Education Consultant for the Wisconsin Valley Library Service. Welcome to our first recorded webinar of 2025, Sunset Strategies, Know When and How to Pull the Plug, presented by Laura Solomon. This webinar is sponsored by the Wisconsin Valley Library Service and the Northern Waters Library Service. We hope you enjoy it.
Hi, welcome to Sunset Strategies, Knowing How and When to Pull the Plug. My name is Laura Solomon, and I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I am the Library Services Manager for the Ohio Public Library Information Network, which is sort of an arm of the State Library of Ohio, although we are an independent agency. Our primary job is to provide broadband internet to all of the public libraries in Ohio, as well as ancillary tech services such as research databases, web development, SMS notifications, and a whole slew of other tech-related services. Here's my contact information. Here's what I look like in real life. And the other thing I want to tell you is that I have now been in libraries for 30 years. And so I have seen some things during that time, and I am going to be sharing with you today some of the things that I have learned during that time from my own experiences and from that of others. So I am breaking today's session down into 3 areas. First of all, did you plan? Oftentimes, unfortunately, that is a negative. Did it actually fail? And then if you've decided it really did fail, how to stop doing it, which is sometimes not always an easy thing to process or to plan. So let's start with that first area of did you plan? Lots of libraries don't do this. From my experience, they say we would like to have such and such a service. They think there is a demand, or they think there's going to be a program or a collection or whatever it is. And they say, okay, so how do we do that? And in a very basic level, but a lot of planning, I think, gets skipped in terms of how much planning needs to happen. If you don't plan ahead, you can't properly evaluate what has actually occurred. To know, first of all, whether or not it's actually failed, or maybe secondly, whether or not it's worth to keep doing. But you can't properly decide whether or not it's been something valuable, and it can become impossible to really even know if you failed. One of the important things I think that does get skipped as part of the early part of this process is justifying the need for whatever the project is. Sometimes I've seen it where it's just a way to jump on the latest buzzword. AI comes to mind. Countless librarians told me back in the Web 2.0 era that they saw this happen a lot in their libraries, especially, for example, with blogging. Many of you may be able to relate to this, and that a library said, we need a blog, not really considering how much effort it takes to do blogging consistently, and that the audience can be very difficult to capture, even when blogs were much more popular. You need to have a business case for this thing that your library wants to do. First, what does the project do? Who is it for? Identify the need for the thing, not the technology first. You need to ask why a whole lot. And this is really important if you have to sell your idea to maybe your library's administrators. They're going to need to be able to justify resources spent on this, and that isn't just money. It's staff time. And if you've been in a library more than 5 minutes, you already know that most library staff don't have time for yet another thing on their plates. So this really needs to be justifiable. Let's look again at project planning, taking a more specific view. First, does it fit the mission? Does this fit in with the mission of your library? You would be surprised sometimes at it, taking a look at your current services and then matching them up against your mission. You might be unpleasantly surprised that there really isn't a tight match there. This is why there is some controversy over libraries that have, for example, maker spaces. There's debate about whether or not they truly fit the mission of a library. And I am a fan of maker spaces myself, but I understand how that might be perceived as not in the bailiwick of a library. I think it's rare for a makerspace to fail outright, but mission is a consideration. Remember, the project has to be justifiable, and the library's mission is usually the first stop in evaluating whether or not it is. You should also start with an accurate description of what the scope of the new thing or the project is going to be. So what will the project do? What are the and some of you may be averse to business words, but I think this really applies here, deliverables. What is the outcome supposed to be? The scope of a project is the sum total of all of its products or end results and their requirements. And this has to be clearly communicated to everyone right from the start. Next, a reasonable cost estimate needs to be put together. And that's not just money. It's other things as well. So the most obvious one that comes to mind is probably staff, right? So staff is whoever is going to be implementing this new service or program or collection or whatever it is. And their time literally is money. And not only that, like I said before, there are very few staff in libraries now that are not overwhelmed in some capacity. So adding another thing may mean also taking away their attention or work from something else, which might lead to the evaluation of other services. Are they as important as this new thing that's going to be added? So that has to be looked at carefully, and that's part of the cost. Of course, funding. This is the easy one, right? We're talking about the cost, funding. But funding can be sometimes an issue. If you may really want to do something, or you may have a business case for something where there's clearly a demand, but the money may not be available. If you really need to do that thing, how are you going to acquire that money? I can give you an example from here in Ohio. A few years back, for a long time, we had a virtual reference service called Know It Now, and it was fairly popular, although, it probably started to decline in use by the late 2000s, early 2010s. At any rate, much of its, if not all of its funding, depended on LSTA grants. And when LSTA said, hey, grants aren't really intended to be something that you use for continuing operating costs, Know It Now could not find another source of funding, and so it had to shut down. So knowing that you have a sustainable source of funding, because if this thing succeeds, that's going to be critical, that is also part of your estimate. And then the physical needs. That can be space, that can be equipment, whatever tools are needed to actually implement this thing. Oftentimes when we're talking about something that is technology related, then we're taking a deep dive into what is available in that particular realm of technology. For example, digital signage. I've seen lots of messages from librarians asking, hey, we want to do digital signage, but we don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't really know what's required other than a big monitor. And fortunately, they're reaching out to people usually who can provide some experience from their own implementations in their own libraries. But sometimes this is also a learning curve, which goes back to that whole idea of staff time being a resource and part of the cost. A really important thing that should be done as part of planning, but unfortunately almost never is planning for stop points. It's a good idea to establish criteria that will help you decide what action you should take at key points in this implementation process, specifically whether you should stop or continue this thing. And stop criteria might include it's becoming clear that the project's objectives can't be achieved. This isn't possible. We've looked into all the things that we could possibly do with this. Maybe this isn't something we can do at our library. Maybe the physical configuration is too much, or the funding can't be sustained. There's all kinds of reasons, but that's a pretty obvious stop point, right? But that's something to be planning for. There are signs that the final product will quickly become obsolete, or the company won't be able to provide support for it, you being the company, right? Sometimes you've bought technology that no longer is being supported. It's reached end of life. Is that a stop point for your project, or do you have a plan B for that? Maybe you've encountered technical difficulties that don't have a quick or an affordable solution. That's another possible stop point. Maybe you've lost key resources or skills that were essential to this project. This happens a lot if someone who essentially held all the keys to the proverbial kingdom and was in charge of this project and knew all the things about the project leaves. What happens then? Do you stop the project? Do you spend staff time bringing someone else up to speed? What happens there? Maybe your library started something and it took some time, and now you look back and go, you know what, this isn't as relevant now as it was then. So maybe we should use this as a stop point and not invest any more time or resources into it. Establishing these kinds of criteria and sort of an agreement with the important indicators of what constitutes success, what constitutes failure, is actually a really critical early step in just project management in general, is knowing when you hit these obstacles, are they going to be worth hurdling? Sometimes the answer is no, and we might not like that, but we have to plan for that. I mentioned before that sustainable funding is a consideration. But one of the things in planning, I think also that doesn't happen enough, is planning for what if something succeeds. And that this was key in the Know It Now service here in Ohio, where they were continually using LSTA grants and not really working to find alternate sources of funding, I think, soon enough to prevent its dissolution. So what happens if what you're doing isn't working? We can plan for that with stop points, right? And then I'll show you how we can also continue down that road if something is going to fail or is failing. And the other part here that we usually don't look at is, what if it actually is doing well? What if it succeeds? Sustainable funding is part of that, but for some projects, success actually might be the worst case scenario, because now, how do you fund it? How do you keep it going? Now there's a demand, right? Think about how heavily ebooks are used in libraries and what happens when that budget gets cut. It's been incredibly successful. People love ebooks and Libby and many of the things like that. People have created a really big demand for those kinds of resources. Now what? If the money goes away or decreases significantly, where are we? We're not in a great place, and we probably haven't planned sufficiently for that. I could give you another example from here in Ohio. The agency that I work for, I mentioned its prime job is to provide broadband internet for all the public libraries in Ohio. Well, one of the things that thankfully was planned for early on and continues to be adjusted is the fact that the use of bandwidth, and that's how we get charged for that internet, the use of bandwidth continually goes up. And it's funny, I can tell you, because after school in public libraries, we can see that the spike in bandwidth when the kids come out of school and start doing things like playing Minecraft and watching YouTube videos. And of course, things were much cheaper before we had things like that. But we do have to accommodate that as part of our planning. What if it succeeds? What do you do then? One of the best rules I ever learned about estimating cost for a project was this, and this was from a former supervisor of mine, and his name was Stephen, and so he called this the rule of Steves. And this is where he learned not to underestimate cost, and this is why he calls it this. When he first got married, his wife and he started a small business, and he had been managing a small business before then and thought he was a good businessman, but he was never, he said, enough of a pessimist about costs. And his business with his wife lost money for 3 straight years before they finally decided to shut it down. And after that, his wife actually devised the rule of Steve's. So whenever Steve would say something like, I think that will cost X, she would automatically add 50%, and that would turn out to be pretty close to the actual cost. So the rule of Steve's is what Steve's think the cost is plus 50%, that equals the actual cost. And I have been sharing this far and wide for many years. I think it's an excellent idea. So you might be thinking, we only need $2,000 for this digital signage project. You should probably add on another 50%. What's the worst case scenario there? You don't use it all? Life goes on, right? But better to be prepared. Another part of planning, sometimes also I think that doesn't get enough attention, and maybe just lots of parts of this doesn't end up getting enough attention, but is the time required. I think we do think about that when we go back and we look at the estimate for cost. We think, okay, it will take so much staff time. But this is adjacent to that, where we're saying, okay, we're going to start here today, and we plan to have this implemented by X date. And here are the steps in between and when these benchmarks should be hit. Some kind of schedule. This is an easy failure point because remember, a lot of projects tend to run over. It's just the nature of the beast. And how do you know how far things have gone over deadline or are behind deadline if one was never set to begin with? So get yourself a schedule, get yourself some kind of timeline. Some of you may have seen this before. It's called the project management triangle. Sometimes it's also called the triple constraint or the iron triangle. The project triangle has a lot of different names. But it's a model of essentially what the constraints of project management are. And it's really not that complicated. It's been used for, more than 50, 60, 70, probably more than 80 years at this point. It's been around a long time. And basically, it's the 3 things I just talked to you about, right? Scope, cost, and schedule. And you put all those things together and how well they're accomplished, and that's the quality of the project. You might have heard the term good, fast, cheap, choose two, which is the common law of business balance, and that holds true with project management, in that oftentimes we will either skip or maybe not pay as much attention to 2 of these or one of these corners of the triangle. And so we might say, yep, okay, we've got the money covered. We know what this is going to be. We've got the scope figured out, but then we really didn't plan the schedule, and this is just lagging, and people are asking, is it ever going to happen? And that's where you end up with quality not quite as great, which is why it's important to cover all 3 corners of this triangle. So you might want to copy that and put it above your desk when you're working on your planning. Some other considerations for planning. Timing. Is this really the time for this project or even for this technology? Is it too bleeding edge to make it useful right now? I think an excellent example of this right now is AI. There's so much controversy about AI, and I'm very ambivalent, I'll say, about AI. I use it, but I have very cautious feelings at best about it. I'm sure many of you also have strong feelings maybe about the copyright issues involved in AI. There's things related to mental health with AI. There's a lot of good that can happen, but there's also a lot of not good that can happen. As an example, I did not several years ago, maybe a couple years ago, I did a webinar on AI tools. And I thought this would just be another iteration of tools because I've taught a lot of things about online tools for years in webinars. And generally people have enjoyed them, but this was the first time I did it with AI, and the pushback was tremendous. I was quite honestly shocked by it, and probably because I had not educated myself enough, but also because the timing, because it was just too early. It was too early. People were still too scared of it. This was very early on, just after the release of ChatGPT, which really in the scope of things wasn't all that long ago, but in the timeline of AI, it seems like eternity. So timing is something you have to be aware of. You might be wanting to implement something that is bleeding edge, but the public may not be ready for it. Are you going to have to settle? Will it affect the outcome or the scope if you can't get everything you want to accomplish this thing? Are you reinventing the wheel? Chances are good that somebody else has already figured out a way to do whatever it is. And when people ask other librarians or other library people, how did you do this thing? That's fantastic because they're not trying to reinvent the wheel and the knowledge can be shared. But compare what they're doing to what you need to do. Does this already exist, this thing, in a way that you can simply use it? Or is somebody already doing a thing? Do you really need someone to code a completely new thing to do that? You want to basically avoid reinventing the wheel whenever possible because that's going to up your timeline and your costs and your staff time and everything else. Competition. Are you in competition with something else? It's unusual for libraries to be in competition with each other, but certainly they can be in competition with, for example, local businesses. I know where I live, there are 2 bookstores in a small town, and there's a newer one and one that's been around forever. And the newer one is just down the road from the library, and it is essentially discerning itself from the other bookstore by offering story times for children. So maybe that's competition, maybe it isn't, but just something to think about. And perhaps one of the most important things that I do think maybe we don't want to think about this is buy-in. It's critical to use. And if your staff doesn't buy into this, it's going to be harder. Not impossible, but it's going to be harder. And the reality is they are staff. They have to do what they're told. That's just part of the job. But having them understand why this thing needs to happen and for them to agree, oh yeah, okay, we need to do this, definitely helps your process go more smoothly. An academic librarian told me several years ago in his institution that they decided, this was a long time ago actually now, decided to buy WebFeet. Some of you may remember it as one of the earliest federated searches that libraries could purchase. And so the institution decided to buy WebFeet, but the decision was made by admins who didn't consult with any of the instructional librarians. And they thought it was, quote unquote, dumbing down search strategy. They thought it took away the teachable moment, and they refused to talk about it in library instruction at all. So essentially the institution purchased this without consulting anybody about whether or not it was a good idea, and the staff said, no, it's not a good idea. You can buy it, you can spend the money, but we're not going to use it. So those are important things, all of them. Evaluation. So not all projects are created equal, and I'm sure that many of you watching this are already thinking about things you've been involved in that maybe didn't go so great. This is why periodic review is really critical, so that you can catch problems early and you can readjust, or to kill maybe a marginal project before it becomes a major failure. Sometimes you do want to listen to your critics. Maybe some of your employees actually do have a point when they say this is not a good idea. With the story about the academic library that I just told, maybe it wasn't a good idea for all of them to just completely ignore this purchase by the institution. But I bet there were some legitimate reasons that could have been brought to the attention of the administration at some point and said, hey, this doesn't really work for us. Here's why. Admins don't know everything. But again, part of the evaluation process. Evaluate at least after the first week of the project being in process, and then after 3 weeks, give the project a deadline by which you'll determine whether or not it's still viable. That can be part of your timeline, is deciding, okay, if we haven't made this benchmark, and these are kind of like stop points, right? But if we haven't made it by here, maybe we really need to not be doing this. It's just not going to be possible, at least at this time. But look at all the factors, the use of plan the project. How are you doing? Were there unanticipated cost overruns? Did another thing nearby, like a bookstore, start offering the same service? Is the project on track to meet the goals of its implementation? So now let's look at whether or not it actually failed, because sometimes we go through our evaluation process and we don't have an easy stop point. It seems like it's not doing well, but how do we really know? How do you recognize failure? The criteria for failure are, as you can guess, heavily dependent on context. A situation considered to be a failure by one person might be considered a success by another, depending on what's going on. So the question is there an objective standard for success? Well, not necessarily. You probably knew this already. In the IT field, there was an influential annual report called the Chaos Report that was done by the Standish Group of Boston, and I don't think they've done one since the pandemic, which is unfortunate. But the last one they published in 2020 showed this: 31% of projects are entirely successful. This is not probably helping you feel better. 50% made it to the finish line, but they exceeded the deadline or the budget, so cost overruns, time overruns, and 19% outright were just canceled at some point along the implementation schedule. So what this means is that, well, okay, 81% actually succeeded, but only 31% of those were actually considered to be actual total successes, which shows just how subjective this can possibly be. And while the Chaos Report is primarily focused on IT projects, I bet every single person watching this can relate to this. If you've been at your library or organization for more than a year or two, I bet you can think back to more than one idea or one project that just didn't make it. And there's nothing wrong with that, because innovating new things has been a core part of most libraries for the last couple of decades at least. But many of those ideas don't make it. And being able to identify a failed project is probably one of the most important steps you can take in this project. You can probably think about things that are just kind of limping along, that it's probably time to cancel, and they just keep going because there was no plan in place in case they weren't going to succeed. So when we're looking at failures, we do have to look at parameters. So the first thing when deciding whether or not a project has failed is to look at what the parameters originally given to the project were. And that's why planning is so darn important. Were those actually realistic and accurate? If you look back and go, we should have planned for 50% more funding and we can't continue without that, the original parameters weren't great. You were set up for failure to begin with, right? If the timeline didn't adequately represent what was happening maybe with the staff, or didn't accommodate what could happen with the staff, maybe staff turnover or maternity leave or people shifting positions. There's all kinds of things that can happen from a staff perspective that can change those parameters, because those parameters were probably set on the idea of a best case scenario when they were set. And not having good starting parameters is often where failure begins. Were people too eager to get the project underway and they skipped a lot of the planning steps? Again, I bet everyone watching this can think of instances where this has happened to them. But there are other causes of project failure. Incomplete or changing requirements. One of the things, this is something we see in IT all the time, is moving the goalposts. In fact, in IT, there's a phrase for it. It's called feature creep. And if you've not heard that before, it basically means the specifications for the project, for whatever that is, were developed, given to the IT people, and then someone comes to them in the middle of the process and says, hey, you know what would be really cool? Can this thing also do A, B, and C, and maybe X, Y, and Z after? That's the thing here. So the goalposts keep moving, and this can kill a project because it means it will never be done. People will get burnt out, and in many cases it's the chase of perfection rather than just good enough, there's nothing wrong with good enough. Lack of user involvement. And what I mean by that is the people who are actually going to use the thing. Now, if people are the people who work in the library only, that's easier, right, to get their input. But if this is something for the public, have you talked to the public? Have you asked the public? And maybe a focus group of some kind, maybe surveys. Because I will tell you one thing I have learned over 30 years in libraries is one of my favorite quotes is that anecdotes are not they're not data. That's my favorite quote. Anecdotes are not data. Getting real input from people and not just anecdotes your staff has heard at the reference desk, it makes a world of difference. And oftentimes you will be pretty surprised by some of the things that come out in those kinds of sessions. Another common point of failure has to do with staff is that there's only one person, that one person with the proverbial keys to the kingdom, right? They've got all the knowledge about this or the only ones who had the expertise to do this thing. What happens when they go? One common thing in IT that I have said, and I've heard many other people say, is if I get hit by a bus, this is what you need to do. Or this is what's going to happen. Because it's important that there's not just one fulcrum that this whole thing rests on, and that fulcrum being one staff person. This is, again, common point of failure because if something happens to that person, they leave. What happens to the project then? You have to make sure you have more than one person who can handle whatever this is. This is one we don't like to think about, but think back to just a few moments ago when I told you the story about the academic librarians and the institution purchasing the WebFeet federated search. The people who are working on a project can engage in patterns of behavior that sabotage it. So before you decide the project itself is a failure, make sure that the people are not the real problem. Some of you have probably worked with a lot of negative people who have been very difficult to work with or have made things more difficult to get done. They get very territorial. Those are all examples of sabotage behavior. And that is a problem, right? Because it's hard enough to get things off the ground. Having someone actively sabotage it is harder, and that can take several different forms. One of those is blocking. This is a pattern that happens when someone in a project promises to do something, but doesn't actually do whatever it is they were supposed to do. And once this happens, other members of the project don't usually start on whatever their task is because person X promised to do it, and that blocks progress for everybody else. So don't let anyone get an exclusive lock on a particular task that is part of the project. If you're asking someone to do research on a particular technology, say, it shouldn't be one person, it should be two people. And they will be able to prompt each other to get it done, as well as not just locking it up in one person. Feeding the trolls. This happens when someone on a project is really acerbic whenever they comment on the work of others on the project. Maybe they treat everyone else like idiots. They say things that are not positive, and that's not to say that people need to be blowing sunshine, but if they're constantly negative, again, very hard to work with. This is where you get into potential sabotage for sure. And soon everyone is reacting to the hateful stuff and not to the work being done. So you've probably heard the expression, don't feed the trolls, stuff them under a bridge. Basically out of the way. Take that person off the project. If they're more of a hindrance than a help, it's time to get them off because you will not be able to get back on track until you do. And along with that goes shooting down ideas. Now, I mentioned you do have to listen to your critics at least sometimes. This is not quite as hateful as maybe troll behavior, but it can still impede a project. When an idea is rejected, here's a great example of this that many of you have probably experienced, is that we've always done it this way, therefore you can't do it your way, right? That's the implied end to that sentence. Just because something has been done a certain way before doesn't mean it can't be done a different way now, and we all know that. But this really bogs down the project, and it's much better to discuss ideas openly and even ask that deficient ideas be reworked so it's clear that they've had their fair hearing and been justly rejected. So you can say, okay, we are shooting this idea down because XYZ. Some other points of failure or causes of failure. Have you ever heard anything like, if so-and-so had only told us XYZ, things would have gone better. This can point to any number of things that the project experienced. So poor project management, not getting that information out, right, which leads to poor communication among the parties. So-and-so didn't tell me, I didn't know this. These are things you do not want to hear as part of the project or the person leading a project. Of course, we all know communication problems happen because we're human, but we need to minimize these as much as possible so that we don't hear things like that. Poor processes for identifying and managing risk associated with the project. And part of that is not having stop points, not having a timeline, not knowing what to do if things go well, all the things we already talked about in the planning stages. Those are processes that are needed before the actual implementation occurs. But when we talk about something failing, we're usually actually talking about something that has failed for more than one reason. It's rare for one thing to simply cut a project off at the knees. Give you an example here actually from my current supervisor who used to be a library director. And he said that when he was in his library, they discontinued their VHS collection. And it came down to an accumulation of reasons. Procedures that weren't easy. They were dealing with collections that hadn't been actively fed for a long time. People would reserve movies in the catalog and not realize they'd ordered the VHS version rather than the DVD version. And there were probably others. So it was multiple failure points, which honestly is maybe easier, right? When you're looking at something going, oh, we need to stop doing this, or, we're going to stop doing it because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this. And that's easier for people to buy into when you stop doing it. Sometimes just one reason is harder to explain unless it's something like the funding ran out or, the LSTA grant went away. Those are maybe easier to understand because everyone understands money. But often you will have more than one failure point. And before you actually pull the plug, you do have to examine what has happened to date and what is happening now and ask yourself or your group, can this be saved? Now, this does not mean heroic efforts. We don't have time for that in libraries for most things. But it's worth looking at the causes to make sure the project can't be saved. Don't be too quick to pull the plug because maybe by fixing one of those problems, you might be able to move the project forward. And maybe it's removing that troll who's being very negative and hard to work with. Maybe it's shifting people around. Maybe it's finding a different technology to accomplish whatever it is you want to do. But you may be able to move the project onwards if you remove one of these holdups, so to speak. But sometimes there is no fixing it, but it's just not worth the resources to try to fix it. And first of all, let's admit that there is no shame in pulling the plug. It's easy to think that you're a failure if your idea fails or something you've invested in fails. We can get very emotionally invested, I think, in some of the things that we become a part of. And sometimes it can feel like a personal loss or failure when something doesn't work out. We're not here to shame anybody. We're here in libraries. Many of us are innovative. This is going to happen. It's going to happen to everyone who tries to innovate in library at some point. Nobody has a perfect success record. So don't feel bad if something isn't working out the way you thought it would be. You tried it. There's nothing wrong with that. And it takes courage, I think, to admit that something didn't work, because nobody likes to admit that something they invested in, whether that's time, personal energy, or whatnot, they invested in it. They don't want to admit it's a mistake, right? None of us want to do that. Like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Well, we all know it happens. And if you're in a position of authority, it's literally your job to figure out if something is a failure and to deal with it. And part of that might be stopping whatever it is. And this is sometimes a hard thing for people in charge, whether that's an actual library administrator or someone in charge of the project, because they can get something that is called decision paralysis. Ronald Klingebiel, I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, is a professor of strategy at the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. This is his quote here. advises people to avoid falling into the decision paralysis trap, because when you're deeply involved in a project, it is easy to become so immersed in the daily minutia of running that project that you lose sight of the bigger picture and you fail to make these important decisions. So sometimes it's easier not to make a decision, but if you're in charge, you need to make a decision. That is literally part of the job description. It also is not too late to pull the plug ever. Don't be afraid of late stage decisions. Once you've made a lot of progress with a project and you're nearing the point of launch or completion, it can be easy to sort of fall into this mindset of, hey, we've come this far, so we have to see it through to the end. But this can be a really problematic way to think, because attention often shifts to delivery, so to speak, as projects move into their later stages. And so people are less likely to ask questions or want to say anything negative, because like, we're almost to the finish line. Nah, don't say that. Again, if you're in charge, it's your job to go looking for this stuff. It's really important to know when the time has come to discontinue a project, even if it's late in the game. Even if the thing you're going to launch is tomorrow, if you realize there's a huge problem, pull back. Pull back. Maybe you don't pull the plug, but at least pull back. But it is never too late to pull the plug. Not ever. So when do you pull the plug? Let's start with when. So assuming you have given a project every chance to succeed, you've gone back, you fixed maybe something from a stop point or something that was holding up the project, so now you've done everything in your power to make sure this thing is going to happen. So when do you actually pull the plug? It can be easy, I think, to just reach a point of frustration with something and say, nope, not doing that anymore, I'm done. But that's not a reasonable way to approach a failing project, especially when you're going to have to deal with what comes after that decision. So you only want to discontinue after an objective evaluation of the quality of the project and what it accomplished or didn't accomplish has happened. And that's not supposed to be an emotional or a subjective evaluation. If your objective criteria, because remember, you set these benchmarks as part of your planning process, remember how important those were, if they still indicate failure, then it's going to be way easier to cancel this thing. No second guessing. It's easier to justify discontinuing the program or service if you can say, yep, failed here, failed here, failed here. Okay, I evaluated it. These were the points of failure. We can't recover from this. It's time to go. Preparing for the aftermath. Pulling the plug is part of a natural process. Not every project or thing that you try is going to succeed. We already covered that. But this is the risk of trying something new. Recognize that up front and try to avoid becoming emotionally attached. Personally, I think that's hard. We all do it, right? We spend a lot of time and effort on these things. But people do become emotionally attached to what might be a pet project of theirs. So having an objective review of why something failed is going to be important ammunition when you're potentially dealing with disgruntled patrons or staff that might be losing something they have feelings of ownership for. So I asked my supervisor about the whole VHS thing and how did people react. And his general response was, it wasn't as big a deal as I thought it would be, because people didn't really want them. So maybe that was an easy win for discontinuing that collection. But he was expecting, I think, more of a backlash than what actually occurred. And it was good for him to be prepared for that. But when you're going to do it, be decisive. Line up whatever support you might need. What that looks like is going to be different depending on you, your library, the project, and then just do it. Be prepared to explain your logic and your reasoning to the people who are upset, but that doesn't mean that you don't do it. If people are going to ring the phone off the hook for days, maybe this is something that should not have been discontinued to start with, as my supervisor's VHS cancellation proved. He said, barely any calls, really nobody fussed a whole lot about it, which is a good indicator that it was okay to cancel it, right? But we need to do it. Once the decision is made, don't drag it out. Don't send mixed signals as part of this. Accept that not everyone is going to be happy when you cancel the project. years ago, a supervisor of mine asked me to do a specific kind of coding project, and I did that, and it was done, and it took a lot of time. And then he came to me one day past the end of the project and said, "I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to use this. The situation has changed." Was I upset? A little, okay? But the thing I said to him was, I still got a paycheck. What happens to what I create is not necessarily part of my job, right? My job is to create those things, not to decide what happens to them after. And sometimes we just have to step back and realize this is still a job, and you still got your paycheck to do it. So, that's very basic, but one thing I have learned in all my years is to become much more thick-skinned for the most part when it comes to the things that I have created or been involved with. After you have finally said, nope, we're not doing this anymore, you've made that decision, you have to take a moment and take what you've learned from the failure and figure out what that means going forward. What have you learned from it? What was the underlying goal of the failed project? Can you attempt to reach that goal in an entirely different way using what you just learned from this project? Maybe it didn't work this way, you canceled it, but could we do it again in a later time, maybe a better time, with different kinds of planning and different kinds of resources, different people involved? Take what you've learned. Don't waste it. You spent a lot of time on this probably by now. Unless the underlying goal is no longer valid, you don't have to completely abandon it, because it might just be time to switch to plan B. Now, you might not have had a plan B, but you possibly had a lot of resources involved in this project. Maybe a lot of research and work was already done. Can you start the process over with a plan B? Yeah, it's okay to do that. And so if you want to pivot to plan B, using those same resources or maybe different resources or planning, whatever, it's okay to do that. Just because something failed once is okay, but you have to make sure you're still going through all of those points in the planning process before you move on with plan B if plan A didn't make it. What about complaints? Because I asked him specifically, are people complaining an obstacle for making what might be an unpopular decision? And he did say, like I said, he didn't get nearly as much complaining about the discontinuation of the VHS tapes as he was expecting. But he was prepared for more than that. And what he told me about whether or not these kinds of complaints potentially happening were an obstacle for him as a decision maker. And he said it was a matter of how much complaining is anticipated. If some service is truly in demand, and again, the phone is ringing off the hook for days, he doesn't think that there would be enough justification to completely cancel it. That's why in most of what he would do, he would replace the service, not just discontinue. That's not always possible. Something that they would just end, usually there weren't big complaints because they did the planning. They understood what was happening. There was not a reason not to continue this thing, or not a good reason to continue this thing. And there weren't many complaints. They were doing the planning, they were doing the evaluation, they were doing the research. And so they knew if they pulled the rug out, there wouldn't be a lot of people displaced by that. And that's really the ideal scenario when you have to stop a project. So the big takeaways from today that I hope you'll take with you. A great quote about failure: the best measure of success is how you deal with failure. I think intellectually, most of us understand that not every project is going to succeed. The problem is none of us want to be part of those that don't make it. But we have to deal with it, and how we deal with it is just as important as all of the other things that are involved with the thing that we are planning to carry out. You have a lot of resources invested in a project, right? And so sometimes it's hard to put those aside. But Sarah Little Turnbull is a very long-time designer and a good friend of Bill Gates' mother. She's actually been called corporate America's secret weapon and the master of the creative accident. She created by accident, freezer to oven Corningware, the 3M dust mask, a few other things. And she said that some of her best designs came when she was on the brink of a totally failed concept, but she didn't let go. And this is where pivoting to plan B really might be in your best interest if it's something that is still needed. Once in a while, by not letting go, she would push herself to a completely different level. And she said, and of course, that's when breakthroughs happen. If you don't stretch, you don't know where the edge is. That's all that I have for this session. I want to thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. If you have questions or you want to share stories of your own with me, I'm always happy to listen to those. You can contact me here. There is my website, there is my email address, and thank you again for listening to me today.